Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very, very accomplished leader from Philadelphia, USA, Suhag Shukla. Suhag, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Suhag is the co-founder and executive director of the Hindu American Foundation. She's actively involved with the Chinmaya mission. She serves on the board of the Bhutanese American Organization of Philadelphia. Suhag is also a thought partner for the Interfaith Center for Great Philadelphia's Paths to Understanding Public Art Initiatives, and she's been named one of the 12 faith leaders to watch in 2017 by the Center for American Progress. So, Suhag, before we talk about HAF, tell me a little bit about your own journey and what motivated you to get so deeply involved in philanthropy?
Sure. So I am kind of a member of one of the earlier generations of the Indian diaspora. Of course, Indian immigrants were coming to the United States in the 1800s as laborers and whatnot. But then there was a long break, about 50 to 70 years, where all immigration from India and other parts of Asia were halted. So then in the early 60s, when those limits were lifted, my father came here to pursue his higher education. And so I was born in the 70s, and a time when, those early immigrants were still kind of carving a space out for themselves, dealing with linguistic barriers and not having any sort of, institutional foundation to lean on. So they leaned on one another and they built the institutions that I'm, really grateful for, because they were very informative in who I am today. And so I was born and raised in California. So I identify, I guess, as a second generation Indian American and Hindu American.
Yeah.
And have grown up kind of straddling both East and West. And because, the way we look, we're constantly questioned about who are you, where are you from? And so that kind of led to a deep exploration of my Eastern roots. And what I found was really profound, and that has stayed with me my entire life.
Fascinating. So talk to me a little bit now about the Hindu American Foundation, and what was the need that you felt to co-found the foundation?
Absolutely. So the Hindu American Foundation is a nonpartisan education and advocacy organization. We are different in that we are a professionalized model. So when the co-founders, we all got together, one of the things that we had decided right up front was that we needed to make education and advocacy a priority in which full-time professionalized staff would carry our mission. And so, we were all second generation Hindu Americans, like I'm shared, that we grew up kind of with both one foot in the East, one foot in the West. And what we found was that when it came to Hindu contributions or Hindu understandings of the world, we were deeply misunderstood. What we knew ourselves to be within the comforts of our homes and communities was very grossly misunderstood by Americans at large.
Correct.
So as we looked to other communities like the Jewish community or the Christian communities, how are they addressing these types of misrepresentations or misunderstandings? And it was through creating institutions where you have people who develop subject matter expertise, who come with a particular pedigree to serve the education and advocacy needs of their respective constituencies. So that's how we started.
Well said. And I think it's an amazing journey that you started and seems to be, getting larger and larger. But tell me, what are some of the challenges that the Hindu Americans face in the United States? And I'm saying this because, one, I've been to the US God knows how many times, but my son lives in the US. My older son lives in Singapore. So, everyone's looking for roots. And HAF seems to be doing an amazing work. So what are some of the challenges Hindus have faced, other than, of course, being not understood.
Right. Well, look, I think that I often talk about the Hindu American experience kind of being bipolar in some sense. There's certainly Hinduphilia, meaning a deep, profound love for all things Hindu. When we talk about things like yoga or Ayurveda, meditation, these types of things have had a tremendous impact on the Western world. I mean, globally, quite frankly.
Correct.
And then on the other end, you have Hinduphobia. So if I were to take this spectrum and maybe put some numbers to it, we're probably looking at anywhere from 75 to 80% of something ranging from Hinduphilia to ignorance or unfamiliarity with the tradition. And then, this little segment of Hinduphobia. So, we overall have had a wonderful story here in this country because you have a secular democracy that promotes religious freedom and religious liberty. Now, that Hinduphobia I would kind of describe as maybe a little bit of an infection, right? Now, and if you don't take care of an infection, it can infect the parts that are healthy. Absolutely. So what might that infection look like? It includes hate crimes. It includes discrimination. It includes, now this misunderstanding, sure, the key to misunderstanding is promoting understanding. But when you have a younger generation that is faced with this sort of misunderstanding, it really leads to sometimes deep questions of identity, of confusion, of depression and anxiety. And so even though misunderstanding may seem benign for us as adults, for children who are straddling two identities, it's really important to address that. So these types of narratives then also impact kids on college campuses, where oftentimes some of these narratives are politically motivated. And so it also leads to some identity crisis at that age. So hate crimes, discrimination, and misunderstanding are probably the top three.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. And how does the foundation work to promote the interests of the community and, of course, educate a lot of the challenges that you've just spoken about?
Well, we've been really fortunate to have an amazing staff, an amazing core of volunteers, whether it's our board members or national leadership council members. And, we believe that responsive and proactive approaches are the better approaches, as opposed to always being on the back foot and reacting. Now, there's a need for that, of course. However, some of our education work, so, we identified that one of the root sources to misunderstanding were public school textbooks in how Hinduism in India are oftentimes portrayed. India is portrayed as very poor. Hinduism is portrayed as primitive, sometimes barbaric and oppressive. How do you address that? So in the United States, textbook reform is something that is at the state level, and it's a political process. So we participate in that. The public has an opportunity to give feedback. Hey, what's wrong with this narrative? How could it be improved? So we're active there. But that's a slow process. Political process kind of changes with the winds. So our proactive aspect to that is we developed a Hinduism 101 curriculum. This curriculum has been used to, train or teach over 85,000 students directly on a more accurate and authentic understanding of Hinduism. We've also trained close to 4,000 public school teachers, which is an investment in long term, right? Because every teacher has maybe 90 students a year. But imagine 90 students a year times a 25 to 30 year career. You've made a tremendous impact in empowering that teacher with better materials that are accurate, so that when she or he has a Hindu American student in their class, what she is presenting to be Hinduism and what that child might know about Hinduism actually align. They're not so divorced from one another where young Indian or Hindu children in class are going, what was that about? It's completely foreign to me. So that's one example.
That's such a wonderful thing that you're doing. I remember when I went for the first time to the US in, I think, 1990, someone in New York in a meeting asked me, so do you have an elephant in your garage? And I said, yeah, not only that, but my children learned how to swim in the pond next to my village, so.
Exactly. I was asked if I lived in a hut. if my family lived in a hut. Now, is that a reality? Absolutely.
No,
But in 1988, I mean, for goodness sakes, you
I know.
remember what it was like in 1988. Sure, there were huts, but
Right.
there were also skyscrapers
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely
computers.
right. Absolutely. My next question to you is also about, and I've been reading a lot about religious freedom and discrimination.
Mhm.
And you spoke a little bit about how Hindus do tend to face the long end of the stick, so to speak. How is the foundation approaching these questions relating to religious freedom and discrimination?
Great question. So, look, I think the key to being able to fight discrimination is to recognize it. And very often in our community, we're a largely immigrant community. So many people took the US citizenship exam.
Correct.
But for
Correct.
some reason, what happens is you study really hard, you cram for the exam, and then you kind of forget about it. You get caught up in your day to day life, your work, your kids, raising a family, putting a roof over your head, and succeeding in your career.
Correct.
And very often, what we find is that people actually don't know what their rights are.
Mm.
And rights are a two-sided coin. It's not just rights that you're entitled to, but that also comes responsibilities. So we do a lot of know your rights and responsibilities type trainings where we empower the community on what does the First Amendment entail? What does religious freedom look like? What are you entitled to in the workplace in terms of accommodation? So, and not only are we training or community members, we're also training employers. We're training first responders so that, say for instance, an ambulance or someone shows up at a temple. What are the things that you might need to be aware of? So cultural sensitivity or cultural competency training, these are all ways in which we can deal more proactively with discrimination and religious freedom. Here in the United States, the separation of church and state is a very well thought out area of the law. There have been countless cases that explore what does religious freedom mean in the United States. And the model here is probably a little bit different than in India in that everyone is under the same set of laws and there's a separation of church and state. What does that mean? So a public school or any government entity cannot endorse one particular religion, nor can it endorse religion over non-religion. So there are cases that come up and very often will participate in those cases to provide a Hindu American voice to say, look, religion is healthiest without government interference, and government is healthiest without religious interference. And that's something that I think has really contributed to a very pluralistic society here in the United States.
Absolutely. And I think the US is one of the few countries which has managed to do this. A lot of countries can't really put their hand on their heart and say, we have separated religion and leadership or politics. But moving on, Suhag, the foundation has also been involved in efforts to combat the portrayal of Hinduism and Hindu Americans in popular culture and media. Can you talk a little bit about this and how do you approach this?
That's a great question. I think that we're a young community still finding our voice. And so very often kind of the knee-jerk response is to just kind of start screaming and making a lot of noise or trying to get something banned. But when you live in a society where there's, free speech is a pillar of the values, our solution has been constructive engagement and more and better speech to counter false speech. Or false speech is actually not protected speech, but say hate speech or uninformed speech. So, there have been times where, someone brings up like, hey, this movie portrayed this way, or this advertisement. More often, advertisements are a little bit easier to deal with because a movie, once it's made and published, it's kind of hard to go back. But advertisements are easier, right? They can take an advertisement down, they can redo it, or there's a number of choices of what you can do. So we oftentimes we tend to go towards quiet diplomacy as our first step. Let's pick up the phone and call whoever the person who's being accused of kind of misrepresenting Hinduism. Let's pick up the phone and see what are their motivations, because we really feel that when something comes across as uninformed or Hindu-phobic, intent matters. And so that's the first thing we do. We pick up the phone, we find out, and oftentimes it's like, oh my goodness, we're so sorry, we didn't realize. That opens up an opportunity for conversation.
Right.
And so we take that opportunity to educate. And so if the motivation was ignorance, well, the ignorance is magical, right? In the sense that it's dispelled as soon as you put knowledge to it. So that then will encourage them to take the right step of either removing the offending product or advertisement, or, being better about it in the future if it's past that point. And if the intent is a malintent, then we might get, grassroots advocacy involved and put more pressure through the public. So it really just depends on the circumstance. But our first step is pick up the phone and call or send an email to figure out, hey, what's going on here?
Well said. Well said. When I was preparing for my conversation with you, I was reading on the internet. There were also a few places where I saw some criticism about, and I wanted to ask you that, and criticism is very easy. Anyone, given today's social media, anyone can throw a stone.
Yes.
But how do you maintain your credibility as a nonpartisan advocacy organization?
It's tough in these days, right? Because on the one hand, the internet has democratized information, but it's very difficult to know what's true and what's not true. And so, our challenges have been great. It's also shrunk the world. So where American sensibilities might come to heads with Indian sensibilities. And so it's difficult. People will make commentary on one another without really having the full context. How do you protect your brand? How do you protect your credibility? By doing the right thing, staying true to your values. And our values are truthfulness, discernment, objectivity. These are the things that we believe are actually also Hindu values. And so we just do that. And where we can, we try to dispel the misinformation. But very often, if you dig a little bit deeper into the criticisms, they're rarely on the merits.
Absolutely.
They're usually ad hominems or straw man attacks. So we've even invited people to debate, say, hey, if you are going to portray us in this way, that's not true. We don't believe it's true. Let's come to the table. Let's debate. I would say 100% of the time, those offers are never accepted because there's, malintent and political motivations behind those types of accusations. Now, that's not to say we've gotten things perfect. When we make a mistake, we will get criticized. But the key difference between that is that it's constructive as opposed to destructive.
Well said. Well said. My next question is that how is a resurgent India helping or supporting the amazing work you are doing as a foundation for Hindus in the US?
So this is probably going to be an answer you may not expect, but I think in the short term, it's actually making it more difficult.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. A resurgent India is becoming a global economic power. It is articulating its interests in a far more forceful manner, as it should. It is making its own decisions. It is not, for lack of a better word, acting like a puppet of any other country. And so where those interests that did have the strings, the puppet strings, feel threatened, the easiest target, and some of them are here in the United States, whether they're in academia, whether they're in the political space, where they feel threatened, who's the easiest target? It's Indians in the diaspora. And so in that sense, I feel that while I am so incredibly hopeful and inspired by the steep trajectory that India is on, it has made life a little bit difficult these days.
I know. No, and thank you for sharing this perspective. I had never thought of it like that, but now that you've told me, you're so right, because you are the soft, if I can use
We're
the
the
word,
soft target. That's
soft
exactly it.
targets, right in the country.
Yep.
You're absolutely
So,
right.
oftentimes what happens is, and here's an interesting thing. The Jewish community has faced similar challenges,
Right.
right? As Israel rises, as Israel does anything, Jews in America are asked to answer to that. And in that same way, Hindus now are made to answer or demanded to make answers or for something that's happening in India on the ground. Well, do you have that same double standard for Italian Americans, Irish Americans, or any other ethnic or national community? The answer is no. And especially for some of us who were born and raised here, I barely know how a parliamentary system works. Why should I have to answer? Now, we have answered because part of our mandate is to educate the public about Hinduism. And with India being kind of the foundation, the sacred homeland, obviously we have to answer on some things, but that's been the fruit of our own study of the tradition and the country and our own visits, but it's still through our experience. We'll never know what it's like to be an Indian in India.
Absolutely. No, but you're flying the Hindu flag in the US under the American banner, so to speak. But and I think Sanatan Dharma and Hindu is that what you're talking about. Hinduism is what you're talking is really digging its roots deep in every country, and more particularly in the US. But I have time for one more question, Suhag, and I wanted to ask you, as you look ahead, what are some of the key priorities of the foundation in the coming years, and how do you think the organization will evolve and grow over the years?
That's a great question. I think scaling our educational work because as I mentioned, that spectrum between Hinduphilia with ignorance and unfamiliarity in the center and Hinduphobia. Knowledge, I think, is the antidote. Obviously to ignorance and unfamiliarity, but oftentimes even Hinduphobia. That if we're able to, we have 85,000 presentations that have been made. What would 250,000 look like? So that sort of scaling is what we're kind of investing in and looking to invest in. There's also, I think, a need or at least a demand amongst Hindu Americans for educational materials that they can use to educate their own families. Not everyone has a temple in the neighborhood, so I hope that we can scale there. And then just securing our civil rights. Over the past at least 2 to 3 years, we've seen some trends that are disturbing to us as Hindu Americans in terms of disparate treatment of Hindu Americans through policies, whether it's on college campuses or cities and states. So really galvanizing the community to better understand the political process so that they can have their voices heard. So if there were 2 priorities, those are probably it. Scaling our advocacy efforts, especially in the realm of civil rights, and scaling our educational efforts as well.
Amazing. And on that note, Suhag, I just want to say thank you so much. As a practicing Hindu, as someone who has been to the US so many times, I think the work that you're doing is absolutely incredible. The fact that you are willing to take the flag, the Hinduism flag and the Sanatan Dharma flag, and talk about it and do so much for the next generation and the generations after that is absolutely incredible and very, very creditable. Thank you for everything that you're doing there. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.